Have you noticed something unsettling? Your mind keeps moving, even when you want rest. Thoughts replaying, emotions rising without permission, focus slipping for no clear reason. The Stoics believed this wasn't weakness. It was a mind without leadership. Today, this Stoic guide will show you how to regain control of your mind, not by fighting it, but by understanding it. Epictetus once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." What he meant was simple. Real control begins when you stop obeying every impulse. Stoicism is not about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming ungovernable from the inside. And it starts with how you relate to your own thoughts. 1. Understand. This first, you are not your thoughts. Most people live their entire lives inside their thoughts without ever questioning them. A thought appears and instantly becomes a belief. Another thought follows and becomes a story. Soon, the mind is no longer observing life. It is reacting to its own noise. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind produces thoughts the way the lungs produce breath, automatically, constantly, without permission. Yet we treat every thought as if it deserves obedience. This is where control is lost. A thought says, "You've failed before," and suddenly the body feels heavy. Another says, "They don't respect you," and anger begins to rise. But notice something important. The thought arrived before the emotion. The emotion is not the cause, it is the result of believing the thought. This is why Stoics focused on judgment, not feeling. Epictetus taught that nothing has power over us until we agree with the meaning we give it. The thought itself is neutral. Your agreement is what gives it authority. Most people never pause to notice this moment of agreement. They merge with the thought so completely that it feels like identity. I am angry. I am anxious. I am weak. But Stoicism invites a different relationship. Instead of merging, you step back. You don't suppress the thought. You don't fight it. You don't try to replace it with something positive. You simply observe it. And observation changes the relationship instantly, because the moment you observe a thought, you are no longer inside it. You are above it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily of this truth, not because he had forgotten it once, but because the mind constantly tries to reclaim control. That's why meditations reads like a conversation with himself. It wasn't philosophy for others, it was training for the mind. When you observe your thoughts, something subtle happens. They slow down, they lose urgency, they lose emotional force, not because you forced them away, but because attention replaced identification. You begin to see patterns, the same fears, the same doubts, the same mental loops. And when you see repetition, you stop mistaking it for truth. This is where real calm begins, not calm as silence, but calm as clarity. You realize that many of your thoughts are not instructions, but habits, old reactions replaying themselves, echoes of past experiences, conditioning mistaken for insight. The Stoic does not ask, "Why do I have these thoughts?" He asks, "Do I need to follow them?" That question alone restores authority, because the mind cannot dominate someone who refuses to identify with every idea it produces. This is the first discipline, the foundation of all others. Before emotional control, before focus, before resilience, you must remember this. You are not the voice in your head. You are the one who hears it. And the moment that distinction becomes clear, mental chaos begins to dissolve, not all at once, but steadily. quietly, inevitably. Control does not arrive with force. It arrives with awareness. 2. Stop letting emotions decide for you. Emotions feel powerful because they arrive uninvited. They don't ask permission. They don't wait for logic. They appear suddenly and demand action. Anger tightens the chest. Fear accelerates the mind. Anxiety pulls you into imagined futures. Most people assume this intensity means emotions should be obeyed. The Stoics disagreed. They understood something critical. Emotions are reactions, not authorities. An emotion is not a decision. It is the body responding to a judgment you accepted without noticing. This is why Stoics focused on judgments, not feelings. Every emotion follows a silent agreement. This is a threat. This is unfair. This must be fixed immediately. The emotion is only as strong as the belief beneath it. Most people never see this layer. They jump straight from feeling to action. They lash out. They retreat. They defend. They explain. They regret. Stoics trained themselves to interrupt this pattern, not by suppressing emotion, but by slowing it down. They understood the emotional chain: thought, judgment, emotion, action. Most people try to control themselves at the final step. Stoics worked at the beginning. When anger appeared, they didn't ask, "How do I release this?" They asked, "What belief gave this power?" When fear arose, they didn't run from it. They asked, "What am I assuming will happen?" This questioning creates space, and space weakens urgency. The emotion doesn't disappear, but it loses its authority. This is the Stoic pause, a moment where emotion is acknowledged but not obeyed. And in that moment, clarity returns. The Stoics knew that emotion becomes dangerous only when it becomes directive. Anger itself is not destructive. Blind anger is. Fear itself is not weakness. Unquestioned fear is. The goal was never to feel less. It was to be ruled less. This is why Stoics were often described as calm in conflict, not because they felt nothing, but because they refused to let feeling dictate character. They replaced one question with another. Instead of, "How do I feel right now?" they asked, "What response aligns with my principles?" That shift is everything, because feelings change by the hour. Principles endure. When your actions are guided by principle, your emotions begin to follow, not the other way around. Over time, something subtle happens. Emotions rise more slowly. Reactions soften. The mind feels less chaotic, not because life is easier, but because leadership has returned to the right place. Emotions still speak, but they no longer decide. And that is not emotional coldness. That is emotional maturity. That is Stoic control. 3. Master the pause. Between thought and action. Most people believe their reactions are unavoidable. Something happens, and the response feels automatic. A comment triggers anger. Silence triggers anxiety. Disrespect triggers the urge to prove something. The Stoics saw this as the great illusion. They understood that nothing external forces an immediate response. What feels automatic is simply a habit practiced for years. The pause exists, but most people rush past it without noticing. Stoics trained themselves to protect that pause, because inside it lives choice. When you react instantly, you act from conditioning. Old patterns, old fears, old emotional reflexes. That is not freedom, that is repetition. The Stoic slows the moment down internally, not by freezing, not by overthinking, but by creating awareness before action. Even a single breath can change the outcome. The pause interrupts momentum. It allows emotion to peak without spilling into behavior, and that interruption is power. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that urgency is often a lie. Most situations feel immediate, but very few actually are. The mind says, respond now, fix this now, defend yourself now. But the Stoic asks a different question. What happens if I don't? Often, clarity arrives. The pause reveals something uncomfortable but freeing. Most reactions are unnecessary. They don't improve the situation. They don't protect your character. They only release emotion. And once emotion is released impulsively, control is lost. This is why Stoics valued restraint so highly. Restraint is not weakness. It is delayed strength. It is the ability to hold energy until it can be used deliberately. When you pause, you regain authorship of your behavior. Instead of being pulled forward by emotion, you step back into yourself. The Stoic response is measured, not because the Stoic is unsure, but because he is precise. Precision requires stillness. Over time, practicing the pause changes your inner rhythm. Emotions rise more slowly, triggers lose their grip, situations feel less overwhelming. Not because life becomes quieter, but because your inner timing changes. You stop being rushed by your own mind, and people notice this. They notice you don't react immediately. They notice you choose words carefully. They notice you're calm under pressure, because the person who can pause cannot be controlled. This is why mastering the pause is one of the highest Stoic disciplines. It turns impulse into intention, reaction into response, chaos into order. And the more often you pause, the more natural it becomes, until one day you realize what once controlled you now simply passes through you. And in that space between thought and action, you finally lead your mind instead of being led by it. If this idea of pausing before reacting resonates with you, it means you're already becoming more aware of your mind. And if you want more Stoic guidance like this, calm, practical, and grounded, consider subscribing to Nexus Mind, not for motivation, but for mastery. 4. Control your attention, not the world. Most people feel mentally overwhelmed because their attention is everywhere except where it belongs. They wake up already thinking about problems. They replay conversations that are finished. They imagine outcomes they cannot influence. They monitor other people's reactions, opinions, and moods. By the time the day begins, their mind is already exhausted. The Stoics understood this clearly. They saw that mental chaos is not caused by too much happening. It is caused by too much attention leaking outward. Attention is not infinite. It is a limited resource. Where you spend it determines how your mind feels. When attention is scattered across fear, comparison, and uncertainty, the mind becomes tense and restless. When attention is gathered and directed, the mind settles. This is why Stoics did not try to control life. They controlled focus. They separated existence into two spheres. What is mine to govern? What is not? My judgments, my choices, my effort. These belong to me. Other people's behavior, outcomes, timing, luck. These do not. The moment you place sustained attention on what you do not control, the mind enters conflict. It begins to argue with reality. Why did this happen? What if this goes wrong? Why are they like this? The Stoics saw this as wasted energy, not morally wrong, but mentally expensive. So instead of asking, how do I fix this situation? They asked, what part of this is actually mine? That question pulls attention back from fantasy into reality, back to action, back to effort, back to responsibility. Attention anchored in responsibility creates stability. This is why Stoics were not easily distracted. They did not chase every opinion. They did not follow every emotional impulse. They did not react to every external movement. They understood that attention is a form of agreement. Whatever you give attention to, you give influence to. Feed fear, and fear grows. Feed resentment, and resentment hardens. Feed distraction, and clarity disappears. But when you withdraw attention deliberately, the mind regains order. This discipline is subtle. It looks like choosing not to replay an insult, choosing not to check again, choosing not to imagine outcomes, choosing to return to the task at hand. Each small return strengthens control. Over time, this practice changes your inner experience. Life does not become predictable, but it becomes manageable. Uncertainty remains, but it no longer dominates thought. Because your attention is no longer scattered across what you cannot command, it is rooted in what you can. This is the Stoic advantage. You don't fight the world. You don't resist life. You simply stop giving your attention to what was never yours to govern. And in doing so, the mind becomes quieter. Not empty, but directed. And a directed mind is a controlled mind. 5. Remove mental clutter. Ruthlessly. A crowded mind cannot be a calm one. Most people believe mental chaos comes from life being demanding. The Stoics saw something else. They saw a mind overwhelmed not by events, but by excess thought. Thoughts that serve no purpose. Thoughts that repeat without resolution. Thoughts that create tension without offering direction. This is mental clutter, not thinking itself, but thinking without discipline. The Stoics understood that the mind, left unattended, will collect thoughts the way a room collects dust, quietly, gradually, until clarity disappears, replaying a conversation long after it ends, imagining future problems before they exist, carrying emotional weight from situations you can no longer influence. None of this solves anything, yet it fills the mind completely, and a full mind cannot move freely. This is why Stoics practiced mental reduction. They didn't ask, "How do I think more clearly?" They asked, "What can I stop carrying?" The past, once understood, was released. Regret was treated as a teacher, not a prison. Worry was examined only if it led to action. Everything else was let go. This discipline requires restraint, the urge to replay, the urge to analyze endlessly, the urge to mentally argue with what has already happened. The Stoic resists these urges, not forcefully, but deliberately. He recognizes that many thoughts feel important only because they are familiar. Repetition creates the illusion of necessity, but familiarity is not usefulness. When a thought appears, the Stoic asks, "Does this require action? Is this within my control? Does this serve clarity or confusion?" If the answer is no, the thought is released, not with frustration, not with judgment, simply released. Over time, this practice changes the mind's atmosphere. Thoughts become fewer, but more precise. Mental energy stops leaking into imagined scenarios. Focus returns to what is real and actionable. This is mental minimalism, and it creates a surprising effect. The mind becomes lighter, decisions feel less heavy, emotions pass more quickly, not because problems disappear, but because they are no longer surrounded by unnecessary noise. The Stoics believed this deeply. You do not need to think about everything to be intelligent. You need to think about the right things. A cluttered mind feels busy. A clear mind feels powerful. And the more ruthlessly you remove mental clutter, the more space you create for judgment, discipline, and calm. Control does not come from mental effort. It comes from mental order. And order begins when you stop allowing every thought to stay. 6. Accept reality without resistance. Much of the suffering in the human mind comes from one quiet habit: arguing with reality after it has already arrived. Something happens, and instead of dealing with what is, the mind says, "This shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't have done that. This isn't fair. This ruined everything." The Stoics recognized this inner resistance as the true source of mental chaos. Not the event itself, but the refusal to accept it. Reality does not negotiate. It does not respond to frustration. It does not reverse itself because we are upset. And yet the mind continues to fight it. This fight is invisible, but exhausting. You replay the moment. You imagine alternative outcomes. You mentally argue with people who are no longer present. All of this consumes energy and produces nothing. The Stoics saw acceptance as an act of intelligence. They understood that the moment something has happened, it belongs to the past. And the past is untouchable. Resisting it is like pushing against a wall that will never move. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean liking what happened. It does not mean giving up on improvement. It means recognizing one simple truth: this is reality. Now I must decide how to respond. That shift is where control returns. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by things themselves, but by the judgments they make about them. The event is neutral. Your interpretation is what gives it weight. When you resist reality, you add a second layer of suffering on top of the first. Pain becomes resentment. Loss becomes bitterness. Disappointment becomes identity. Acceptance removes that second layer. The pain may still exist, but it is no longer multiplied. This is why Stoics practiced immediate acceptance, not emotional suppression, but mental alignment. They aligned their mind with what already was, so they could act clearly. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they asked, "What does this moment require of me?" That question transforms chaos into direction. Acceptance frees mental energy. Energy that was trapped in frustration returns as focus. Energy that was wasted on resentment returns as clarity. Energy that was lost in rumination returns as strength. Over time, this discipline creates calm resilience. Life still presents hardship. Loss still occurs. People still disappoint. But the mind stops collapsing under resistance. Situations feel lighter because they are no longer carried twice. The Stoics believed this deeply. You cannot control what happens, but you can control whether you suffer twice. Once for the event, and again for resisting it. Acceptance ends the second suffering, and when resistance disappears, the mind settles. Not because life is easy, but because you are no longer fighting what cannot be changed. This is not passivity. This is mental freedom. The freedom to respond clearly, act wisely, and move forward without dragging yesterday into today. And a mind that can accept reality without resistance is a mind that cannot be broken by it. 7. Detach from the need for approval. The need for approval is one of the quietest and most powerful forces controlling the human mind. It rarely announces itself. It hides behind politeness, behind overthinking, behind the desire to be understood, behind the fear of being judged. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the moment your peace depends on someone else's opinion, your mind is no longer sovereign. It is being negotiated. Approval feels harmless at first. A compliment lifts your mood. Agreement feels reassuring. Being liked feels safe. But over time, a pattern forms. You begin measuring yourself through reactions. You replay conversations. You second-guess decisions. You adjust your words, your tone, your behavior, not because it's right, but because you want acceptance. This is where control quietly slips away. Marcus Aurelius warned himself not to hand over his inner life to the voices of others. He knew that applause and criticism come from the same place, external judgment, and anything external is unstable. Today they praise you. Tomorrow they misunderstand you. Next week they forget you entirely. If your mind rises and falls with that cycle, it will never rest. The Stoics replaced external approval with internal standards. They did not ask, "Did they like what I did?" They asked, "Was it honest? Was it disciplined? Was it aligned with reason?" These questions anchor the mind. When you live by inner standards, approval becomes optional, pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes information, not a verdict. You can listen without collapsing, reflect without self-hatred, adjust without losing dignity. This detachment creates a powerful shift. You stop performing. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop chasing reactions. Your actions become quieter, but more solid. And people feel this solidity. Because the person who does not seek approval cannot be easily influenced. They cannot be flattered into compromise. They cannot be shamed into silence. They cannot be pressured into betraying themselves. This is why Stoics valued indifference to opinion, not indifference to people, but indifference to judgment that does not improve character. They understood this truth. If you need everyone to approve of you, you will never act freely. But if you approve of yourself based on reason and principle, you gain something rare, inner authority. Over time, this discipline calms the mind. The constant background noise of "what do they think? What if I'm wrong? What if I disappoint?" begins to fade. Not because you stopped caring, but because you learned where caring belongs, within your control, within your character. And when approval no longer controls you, your mind finally rests in its own hands. That is Stoic independence. That is mental sovereignty. And a mind that governs itself cannot be ruled by the crowd. 8. Practice daily. Mental discipline. Mental control is not something you turn on when life becomes difficult. By then, the mind is already moving too fast. The Stoics understood that the mind, like the body, only performs well under pressure if it has been trained in calm moments. This is why they treated mental discipline as a daily responsibility, not an emergency tool. Most people wait until they are overwhelmed to try to calm themselves. Stoics prepared before overwhelm arrived. They knew this truth. You cannot reason clearly in chaos if you have never practiced clarity in peace. Daily mental discipline does not mean constant effort. It means consistent alignment. Small acts of awareness, repeated. Marcus Aurelius did not write meditations to teach others. He wrote to correct his own thinking. Each entry was a return, back to reason, back to restraint, back to perspective. This daily return is what kept his mind ordered, despite immense responsibility and pressure. The Stoics practiced mental rehearsal. They imagined challenges before they arrived. not to worry, but to remove surprise. When difficulty is expected, it loses its power to shock. They practiced self-restraint in ordinary moments, choosing not to react, choosing silence, choosing patience, not because the moment demanded it, but because the habit required it. This is how discipline forms. The mind becomes familiar with control. Stoics also practiced daily reflection, not to dwell on mistakes, but to transform experience into insight. They reviewed their day calmly. Where did I lose control? Where did I respond well? What lesson does this moment offer? This reflection turned failure into instruction instead of shame. Over time, this daily discipline reshapes the mind. Reactions soften, emotions rise more slowly, awareness arrives sooner. Not because emotions disappear, but because leadership returns. The mind begins to trust itself. You stop feeling at war with your thoughts. You stop fearing emotional waves. You stop dreading difficult moments, because you know you have trained for them. The Stoics believed this deeply. Freedom is not found in avoiding difficulty. It is found in being prepared for it. A disciplined mind does not panic under pressure. It responds, and that response feels calm, not because life is easy, but because order has replaced chaos inside. This is the quiet power of daily mental discipline. No one applauds it, no one sees it, but over time, it becomes unmistakable. The mind feels steadier, the inner world feels organized, and control stops feeling like effort. It becomes who you are. 9. Reduce dependence on external validation. A mind that needs constant reassurance is never fully at peace. The Stoics understood this with clarity. They saw how easily the mind becomes unstable when it looks outward for confirmation, approval, agreement, recognition, validation. The moment your sense of worth depends on how others respond, your mind is no longer anchored. It drifts. Praise lifts you, but only briefly. Criticism unsettles you, often for much longer. And silence. Silence makes you question yourself. This is not strength, it is dependency. The Stoics believed that a person who needs validation has quietly surrendered authority over their inner world, not because approval is bad, but because external things are unreliable. Opinions change, people misunderstand, crowds forget. If your mind rises and falls with that movement, it will never stabilize. This is why Stoics built their identity inward. They did not ask, did they like what I did? They asked, did I act with reason? Did I stay true to my principles? Did I do what was within my control? These questions create internal alignment, and alignment creates calm. When you reduce dependence on validation, something important happens. You stop performing. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop adjusting your values to fit the room. Your actions become quieter, but more deliberate. You begin to feel grounded, even when others disagree. Not because you are stubborn, but because your worth is no longer being negotiated. This does not mean rejecting feedback. Stoics listened carefully to criticism, but they filtered it. If it improved character, they considered it. If it was noise, they released it. This distinction protects the mind. Validation seeking blurs this line. Everything feels personal. Every reaction feels significant. But when approval loses its grip, clarity returns. You begin acting from self-respect instead of self-doubt. Over time, this changes how life feels. You speak with more certainty. You move with more calm. You stop fearing judgment. And people notice, because the person who does not need approval cannot be easily influenced. They cannot be flattered into compromise. They cannot be shamed into silence. They cannot be controlled by opinion. The Stoics believed this deeply. True confidence does not announce itself. It stands quietly. When your approval comes from within, the mind settles. Not because others stop judging, but because judgment no longer decides who you are. This is Stoic independence. This is emotional freedom. And a mind that is free from validation is a mind that finally belongs to itself. 10. Return to principle. Again and again. The greatest misunderstanding about mental control is the belief that once you achieve it, it stays forever. The Stoics knew this was false. They understood that the mind is not something you conquer. It is something you continually guide. Even the most disciplined mind drifts. Even the calmest person feels shaken at times. Even the strongest character faces moments of doubt. This is not weakness. It is reality. Stoicism never promised permanent peace. It promised a way back. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself not because he had failed, but because he knew forgetting was natural. Forgetting your principles, forgetting your perspective, forgetting who you decided to be. Control is not about never forgetting. It is about remembering quickly, remembering that emotions pass, remembering that thoughts are not commands, remembering that character matters more than comfort. This act of remembering is what Stoics called returning to principle. When emotion pulls you off center, you return. When anger rises, you return. When fear clouds judgment, you return. Not with force, not with self-criticism, but with quiet resolve. You ask yourself, what is within my control right now? What response aligns with reason? What kind of person do I choose to be in this moment? These questions do not erase emotion. They place it back in its proper role. Emotion informs, principle decides. This is the difference between a reactive mind and a governed one. Returning to principle creates consistency. You become steady, not because you feel calm, but because you act with alignment. And alignment creates trust in yourself. Over time, this trust changes everything. You stop fearing emotional storms because you know how to navigate them. You stop chasing constant calm because you understand that calm returns naturally when you stop fighting yourself. You develop patience with your own mind. You no longer panic when chaos appears internally. You no longer judge yourself for drifting. You simply return, again and again. And each return strengthens leadership. The mind learns. There is guidance here. There is structure. There is direction. Eventually, control stops feeling like effort. It becomes familiarity. You recognize the early signs of imbalance. You respond sooner. You recover faster. Not because life is gentle, but because you are grounded. This is the final Stoic truth. A mind that knows how to return to itself can never be enslaved by circumstance. It may bend, it may wander, but it will not break, because it is guided by principle, not impulse. And a person who lives this way does not need to dominate the world to feel powerful. They govern themselves. And that is the highest form of control. Conclusion: regaining control of your mind doesn't mean eliminating emotion, silencing thought, or becoming detached from life. It means understanding yourself deeply enough that nothing external gets to decide who you are. The Stoics never chased a quiet world. They built a quiet mind. And that calm wasn't fragile. It didn't disappear under pressure. It returned again and again through awareness, discipline, and principle. If you practice even a few of these ideas consistently, you'll notice something subtle but powerful. You react less. You think more clearly. You feel steadier, even when life is loud. That's not luck. That's inner control being rebuilt. If this guide helped you see your mind differently, and you want more Stoic lessons that build calm strength without noise, ego, or false motivation, subscribe to Nexus Mind. Not to escape reality, but to master it. Your future self will thank you.